Hey guys, welcome to part 6 now of this Mastering in Ozone 7 tutorial course where we've yet to actually talk about Ozone. This is the final video where we'll be discussing the last little thing that you need to kind of be cognizant and aware of before you ever get to any level of mastering your own music, whether it's in Ozone 7, which hopefully it is, or otherwise. So this video is called Prepping the Mix for Mastering. And this is just something I wanted to make a kind of a checkpoint bullet point list for you guys, one that I have gathered from multiple resources over the years. So the first thing that you should do with your mix is check your levels. Check your levels on the master bus and check your levels on a track by track basis. So if I had a full session pulled up, I'd want to look at every track as it's playing, make sure nothing's too hot and nothing is clipping. So you have two kind of gray areas here. You'll either run into one of these two problems. You'll be clipping, you'll be too loud, or you'll be too quiet. You don't really want either, because then if your mix is too loud, you're not going to allow the mastering process or Ozone 7, you're not going to allow the plugins and the features that it has to actually shine through and affect your mix in a positive way. Now, the inverse of that is, if it's too quiet, you're going to have to pump Ozone harder than you should, and you're going to get some kind of less than musical results. So you want to find a good balance within your levels, and a good way to determine if you have good balance is you should have about 6 to 3 decibels of headroom. When you're starting out, I would suggest airing more towards the 6 decibels of that equation, or what I just said. If you don't allow any headroom when you compress or limit inside of Ozone, it's just going to sound squashed. It's going to kill the dynamics and life of your mix. And if you have too much headroom, you're going to have to harshly affect your mix, which isn't going to be good. You're going to have to actually compress and limit to get the volume up. So if that's the case, turn things up in your mix. Now, the second thing that I would suggest you do is check your inserts on the mix bus, or your master bus, or your 2 bus in the mix. I talked about this briefly, or I guess a good amount in the previous video. I mix into a channel. I mix into a compressor, a sausage fattener, and very, very, very light limiting. Sometimes when I mix, I'll even mix into an EQ as well, depending on what I'm going for with the sound. Now, I would not personally remove all of those things. I would just make sure that they're not hitting the overall audio, isn't hitting those elements too harshly or too hardly. So what I like to do is I like to mix into certain mix bus elements. There are some people who say, why would you want to do that before you send it to a mastering engineer, before you try mastering it yourself? I consider it part of the mix process. And I guess the easiest way to look at it is 20, 30 years ago, if you were mixing on an SSL console, for instance, you would run almost everything into the G channel, which was compression. You'd run almost everything into EQ. You'd sum groups to EQ. So I don't look at having a few plugins like compression and EQ or a sausage fattener on my 2 bus, my mix bus, as mastering. I look at it as mixing. And if it adds a cool effect to the song, then I'm all for it. Now, checking your inserts also kind of evolves into check your actual plugins on each track. Let's say you have an instance of Massive and you have EQ, compression, and then you have FabFilter Saturn or Camel Fat distortion or something like that. Make sure you're not clipping on a plugin level either. Check your inserts. Don't just say, okay, my track isn't clipping. Make sure you're not getting a lot of unneeded clipping and saturation coming from each plugin. Because if you have 5 or 6 or 7 tracks where you have clipping in a compressor or an EQ, or you really wouldn't have an EQ, you shouldn't, but a compressor, a saturator, a distortion, anything like that, that's going to add up and kind of add some unwanted noise into your track. So check that, make sure everything's clean and good. Now the third thing I would suggest doing is check your mix in mono. I have a whole tutorial course on this on the ADSR network, so I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time discussing it right now. So if you are subscribed to the subscription, just watch that video if you're curious. But if your mix sounds like crap in mono, it's not going to translate well in a master environment. And the reason for that is not because you're mastering in mono or anything like that. It's because mono really tells you what your mix is lacking. It usually reduces low and high end frequencies and kind of just bottlenecks the middle of the road in terms of frequency. So if you're not hearing width, you're not hearing certain instruments will disappear. Sometimes your low end will get weak. That's a mix thing. So go back and check, your mix in mono. And if the mix doesn't sound good in mono, go back and improve it in mono and stereo, and then it should translate to a better overall mastered song. So this is the step, prepping your mix for the master, where you start to go back and think about your mix and make the final changes. Because once I print to a 2-track, I don't want to go back to mixing. I just want to master the project and be done, because at this point, it's probably taken me like a month just for this one song to get it finished how I want. So I'd prefer not to keep going back and forth between mixing and mastering. So I like having this little kind of prep work, this little 3-step list that I can reference before I hit Ozone 7 and mastering. All right, so without further ado, I will see you in the next video where we're actually going to be jumping into Ozone 7. I'll see you there.